Welcome to today's deep dive. We're going to be looking at Plato's Republic, specifically Book 3,
Okay.
and we're going to be unpacking all his ideas on musical accompaniment and meter and how those two very specific things relate to education as a whole.
Right.
So you might be thinking, music and education?
Mm-hmm.
That's a little bit of a stretch, right?
Yeah.
But trust me, for Plato, these things were very deeply intertwined.
Absolutely.
So what do you think about that?
Well, in the Republic, Plato uses the analogy of building an ideal city to explore the fundamentals of a just and virtuous society. And what might surprise you is just how much emphasis he places on music in shaping the very souls of its citizens.
Yeah, it's definitely not the first thing that comes to mind when you think about, ancient Greek philosophy, right?
Yeah.
Where does he even start with this whole music education thing?
Well, he begins by kind of dissecting music into its core elements. He breaks it down into words, harmony, or modes as they were called, and rhythm. And he dives deep into each of these components, meticulously analyzing their effects on the human soul.
Okay, so he's not just talking about enjoying, like, a catchy tune, right?
Right.
He's looking at the building blocks of music and how they impact us on a much deeper level.
Yes.
But why so much attention to detail?
Well, Plato believed that music possessed this really remarkable power, the power to imitate the soul. He argued that different musical modes could cultivate different qualities in a person. Some modes, he believed, could inspire courage and discipline, while others could lead to weakness and indulgence.
So, like, music is almost a mirror,
Okay.
reflecting the state of, our inner selves. And by choosing certain types of music, we can actually, like, shape ourselves.
Yes.
Become more virtuous or conversely more prone to vices.
Precisely. And that's why Plato gets incredibly specific about which musical modes are allowed in his ideal city. He actually goes so far as to ban certain modes altogether.
Wait, hold on. Band modes?
Yeah.
That sounds pretty extreme. What kind of music got the thumbs down from Plato?
He singles out modes like the Mixolydian and Lydian and Ionian, associating them with qualities like sorrow, softness, and even drunkenness.
Huh.
Imagine the kind of music that might be played at a funeral or a wild revelry. He believed these modes encouraged emotions and behaviors that were detrimental to the development of a strong and virtuous character.
So no sad songs or party anthems allowed in Plato's Republic, huh?
Right.
I'm starting to get a sense of what kind of vibe he was going for,
Yeah.
But what about the music that did make the cut?
Yeah.
What were the approved tunes that would, like, fill the streets of his ideal city?
The modes that Plato championed were the Dorian and Phrygian. He associated these with qualities like courage, self-control, and noble action, qualities essential for both warriors and wise leaders.
I see. So we're talking about music that would inspire you to face a challenge, to stand tall on the face of adversity, to make those tough but virtuous choices.
Yes.
It's almost like he's creating the soundtrack for building a society based on strength and wisdom.
That's a great way to put it. For Plato, music wasn't just about entertainment. It was a fundamental tool for shaping individuals, and by extension, the entire social fabric of his ideal city.
Okay. I'm starting to see why he spent so much time thinking about music.
Yeah.
It's about so much more than just, what sounds pleasant to the ear. He's tapping into this idea that music can actually shape our inner world, our character, our very essence.
Exactly.
It's not just about the modes themselves. Plato also dives into the specifics of rhythm and meter. He believed that just as some melodies could encourage negative traits, so too could certain rhythmic patterns.
Yes.
So he's really looking at the nuts and bolts of music, dissecting it from every angle to understand its power and how it can be harnessed to cultivate virtue. This is like really making me think about the music I listen to and what it might be subtly encouraging in me,
That's a great point. Plato's ideas, while ancient, can still make us reflect on the music we surround ourselves with today and the impact it might be having on us, whether we're conscious of it or not.
So we've covered the modes and rhythms that Plato deemed acceptable in his ideal city. But he also mentioned words as a key element of music.
Right.
Did he have anything to say about those?
He did. And this is where he delves into the realm of poetry, specifically epic poetry, and how it should be used in education.
Oh, okay. I can't wait to hear what he had to say about that. It seems like every element of music is under scrutiny in Plato's Republic.
Indeed, because for Plato, shaping a virtuous soul, both individually and collectively, was a matter of carefully orchestrating every element of life, and music played a surprisingly central role. But as we touched on earlier, Plato didn't stop at music alone. He saw a deep connection between music and poetry, particularly epic poetry, and he had very specific ideas about their role in education.
Right, because as we discussed, for Plato, music wasn't just about sounds. It
Right.
was also about words, the stories and the emotions that they convey. So how did he envision poetry fitting into this grand scheme of shaping, virtuous citizens?
Well, for Plato, poetry, especially the epics, served as a powerful tool for transmitting values and moral lessons. Think of the stories of heroes like Achilles or Odysseus. These tales were filled with examples of courage, wisdom, and self-control, qualities that Plato wanted to instill in the youth of his ideal city.
So those epic poems almost became like textbooks,
Right.
for learning about virtue and navigating the challenges of life. But didn't Plato also have some concerns about certain aspects of those traditional stories?
You're absolutely right. While Plato saw the immense value in epic poetry, he also believed that some of the traditional tales needed some careful editing. He was particularly wary of stories that depicted the gods behaving badly.
I mean, like Zeus
Yeah,
with his endless affairs and fits of rage. I
exactly.
could see how that might not be the best role model for young citizens striving for virtue.
Exactly. Plato felt that these depictions of divine misbehavior could undermine respect for authority and potentially encourage people to justify their own immoral actions. He wanted the gods to be portrayed as paragons of virtue, beings worthy of reverence and emulation.
So it sounds like a bit of divine PR was in order.
Yeah.
But what about the human characters in these epics? Did Plato have any issues with their behavior as well?
He did. He wasn't fond of stories that depicted heroes succumbing to excessive grief or lamenting their fate. He wanted his citizens to be resilient, to face adversity with courage and composure. Wallowing in sorrow, he believed, was detrimental to the development of a strong and virtuous character.
So no tragic heroes allowed in Plato's ideal city.
Hmm.
It seems like he was really trying to create a culture that emphasized strength,
Yeah.
both internal and external.
Hmm.
But you mentioned that Plato believed in editing these stories.
Yeah.
Did he really advocate for censorship?
Well, it's important to remember that Plato was operating in a very different cultural context than our own. The idea of freedom of speech, as we understand it today, didn't really exist in ancient Greece. For Plato, the well-being of the state and the cultivation of virtue in its citizens were paramount. And if that meant carefully curating the stories and ideas that people were exposed to, well, he saw that as a necessary measure.
It's definitely a controversial approach,
Yeah.
and one that raises a lot of questions about the balance between, you know, artistic expression and social responsibility.
Mm.
But setting aside the issue of censorship for a moment,
Yeah.
I'm curious about the practical side of things.
Right.
How did Plato envision this poetic education actually happening? Did he have any specific methods in mind?
He did, and this is where music comes back into play. Plato believed that simply reciting poems wasn't enough to truly capture the hearts and minds of young people. He advocated for setting these poems to music, believing that the combination of words and melody would make the lessons more engaging, more memorable, more likely to be internalized.
So we're not just talking about like dry recitation.
Right.
We're talking about like full-on musical performance.
Yes.
Using the power of melody and rhythm to enhance the emotional impact of the words. I can imagine like those ancient classrooms filled with the sounds of epic poetry set to music.
Exactly. And Plato didn't stop at just listening and reciting. He encouraged active participation, urging students to sing, dance, and even compose their own poems and songs, always within the established moral framework, of course. He saw this creative engagement as essential for truly integrating the lessons of virtue into their souls.
It's a fascinating blend of control and creativity. On the one hand, there are strict guidelines about content and acceptable forms of expression. But on the other hand, there's this emphasis on active participation, on using music and poetry to express oneself within those boundaries. It's almost like a musical sandbox, but with very specific rules about what you can build.
That's a great way to put it, and it highlights a key aspect of Plato's educational philosophy. He believed that education wasn't just about stuffing information into people's heads. It was about shaping their character, cultivating their love for what is good, true, and beautiful. And he saw music and poetry as powerful tools in that process.
So for Plato, education wasn't just a matter of intellect. It was a matter of the soul. But we've talked a lot about the content of this education, the modes, the rhythms, the stories.
Mm.
Did Plato have anything to say about the ultimate aim of this musical and poetic training? What was he hoping to achieve?
Well, as you might have guessed by now, for Plato, it was never simply about aesthetics. It wasn't about creating, beautiful music or writing clever poems for their own sake.
Hmm.
His ultimate aim was much loftier and in some ways even more audacious,
Yeah.
to cultivate virtue in the individual and by extension to create a just and harmonious society.
So it wasn't just about pleasing the ears
Yes.
or stimulating the intellect.
Right.
It was about shaping the very moral fabric of a person
Mm-hmm.
and then using that to like create a better world.
Precisely. Plato believed that by exposing individuals, especially young minds, to carefully curated music and poetry, they would internalize the values embodied in those art forms. Courage, justice, temperance, wisdom. These qualities, he believed, could be nurtured through a sustained engagement with the right kind of aesthetic experiences.
So it's almost like a process of osmosis, right?
Yeah.
By immersing yourself in beauty and harmony, you absorb those qualities into your own being.
That's a great analogy. And Plato took this idea very seriously. He believed that the development of a virtuous soul was a lifelong process, and that music and poetry played an essential role in that journey.
So it wasn't just about like childhood indoctrination.
Right.
It was about creating a culture where beauty and virtue were intertwined,
Mm.
where art was not simply entertainment, but a vital force for moral and spiritual upliftment.
Right.
But I'm curious, how did Plato connect music and poetry to virtue?
Yeah.
What was the underlying mechanism that made this transformation possible?
Central to Plato's thinking was the concept of mimesis, which means imitation.
Right.
He believed that all art, including music and poetry, is essentially an imitation of reality, of the human experience, of the eternal forms or ideals.
So when we engage with art, we're not just like passively observing.
Mm-hmm.
We're actively participating in a process of imitation, absorbing the essence of what we're experiencing.
Exactly. And Plato believed that this act of imitation had a profound impact on our souls. If we're constantly exposed to images and narratives of violence, greed, and selfishness, those qualities will start to take root within us.
Hmm.
Conversely, if we immerse ourselves in beauty, harmony, and virtue, those qualities will begin to shape our own character.
So it's almost like a moral training program, right?
Yeah.
But instead of lectures and rules, it's music and poetry that guide us towards virtue.
That's a good way to think about it. For Plato, art was not just a reflection of reality, it was a powerful force for shaping reality, for molding individuals and societies into something closer to the ideal.
That's a pretty lofty vision. But I have to ask, how realistic is it?
Yeah.
And can we really expect music and poetry to solve all of society's problems?
Well, Plato was certainly an idealist. And even he acknowledged that achieving a perfectly just and harmonious society was a, a challenging, perhaps even impossible task.
Right.
But that didn't mean it wasn't worth striving for.
So it's more about setting a high bar,
Yeah.
aiming for something better, even if we never quite reach perfection.
Exactly. And I think that's where Plato's ideas can still resonate with us today. He reminds us of the power of art to inspire, to elevate, to connect us to something larger than ourselves. He challenges us to be mindful of the stories we tell, the music we create, the images we surround ourselves with, because they are shaping us, whether we realize it or not.
That's a powerful message. It makes you think about the cultural landscape we inhabit today.
Mhm.
Are we creating art that inspires virtue, that encourages us to strive for something higher? Or are we simply reinforcing the baser instincts, the shallow desires, the endless cycle of consumption and
That's the question we all have to grapple with.
Yeah.
And I think there's no easy answer. But Plato's insights provide us with a valuable framework for thinking about these issues. He reminds us that art is not just a form of entertainment, it's a fundamental aspect of the human experience, with the potential to shape not just individuals, but entire civilizations.
Well, we've certainly had a lot to chew on in this deep dive, from musical modes and poetic censorship to the concept of mimesis and the pursuit of virtue. We've explored a rich and complex tapestry of ideas. A huge thanks to our expert for guiding us through Plato's fascinating and often challenging world.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, the next time you listen to a piece of music or read a poem, ask yourself, what is it imitating? And what is it cultivating within you?
A profound thought to leave us with. Until next time, keep diving deep and keep those minds expanding.